Thank you. Enjoy.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Before I begin, I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners, past, present, and emerging on the lands that we are today, and the sea country that we operate on across the Great Barrier Reef. I'm Dr. Ben Mashirian. My background is not in ecology or coral restoration. It's actually in robotics and collaborative robotics with UAVs, with sort of surface vessels and underwater robots, and how they work in a team, and in addition, how do they work with humans as well. So it's a little bit different. And I also feel, coming to this symposium, that I'm feeling like I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, all of you, and learning so much, because it's like an underwater universe, because you can go so deep, in each of the little different areas, but we can go so broad as well. So today I'm looking at scaling of technology to automate coral deployments for large-scale reef restoration across the Great Barrier Reef. I swiped this slide, and we're sort of looking at RRAP and its process as we grow over the last few years. And the area that we're trying to go towards is looking at hectares now, and then tens of hectares. And in a way, we're setting the scene to look at how we can operationalize our interventions at a bigger scale. Some of the methods that have worked for us until now may not work in the future, and we also need to identify bottlenecks to scale our operations. So for the pilot deployment program, we're first beginning to look at operating in a reef that you're from the surface about 10 meters. So what this does is it broadens the challenge a little bit technologically. In a sense, we need to develop flexible methods that operate for a range of people and technology, and we also need to scale efficiently, because if our technology is too expensive, it lowers uptake, and then we can't scale. And we also need to look at different ways that we can collaborate broadly and make it easily accessible for others and everyone to operate with. One example of that is looking at, phones, for example. In 2007, you have the release of the iPhone, a smartphone, and today we're using it in all sorts of ways. I've seen things where you do, people using their iPhones for underwater photogrammetry, for their various monitoring as a real-time field tool. And I'm like, wow, what a great way to enable uptake. And, there's so many different tools out there, and we're only beginning to scratch the surface with how we use them. However, there's so much different ways of doing this when it comes for site selection and choosing the right sites. And then that also creates a trade-off with resolution. The higher the resolution we get, if we were to start straight, the more expensive it becomes. So we begin to look at what is almost the Goldilocks approach for which technologies we use where to get to different sites. And likewise, at what scale do we begin to employ different types of technology, such as uncrewed surface vessels, or do you augment your crewed vessels to have autopilots as an intermediary as well? And then there's always drones as well, So then that begs the question around scalability. When we want to scale, does it get more expensive? And perhaps initially it might, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it always will be. The other aspect of this is how we scale, and how do we utilize that technology to drive down cost across the supply chain. And where Carly looked at across the supply chain for the CAD devices, there are particular bottlenecks that we're identifying and looking at how do we further automate, or how do you further grow that? Or also, how do we work with our partners across the Great Barrier Reef, whether they're traditional owners, whether they're marine operators, or whether they have aquaculture facilities, that they will in the future, and this year, next year, more or less pick up most of the capacity for us to grow at scale. And then finally, it's how do we do this without sacrificing engagement? because you could have the best tech in the world, you can do that, but then if you alienate everybody, you lose, you know. And so it's that unity and that coherence between the different elements that really will allow us to grow systematically. So with the pilot deployment program, we'll be scaling exponentially. And we're looking at having an average, for the CAD devices, an average of 5 per year. And in addition, for each of these deployments, as we saw with a lot of the work that Beck Forster, the CAD team, are doing, is that we're looking at ways to make these deployments guided. Because what's the point of putting all of that money and investing in this process if we can't actually guide them and then track them and monitor them so that we get effective restoration? So at the beginning of this process, we have site selection. There's an incredible amount of research and modeling going on through the RRAP program, where they're looking at the site level and then narrowing that down so that when you're on water, you can maximize your bang for your buck, in a sense, so that you don't have to almost mow the lawn for like large areas of the reef. I mean, naturally we're going to have to do that, but you can actually probably save on a lot of cost there as well. And speaking of, that's where the other element of guided deployments comes in. Is one of the things we're looking at is, a lot of vessels today, they have, for fishing, I was looking at, BCF the other day. I was like, wow, that's an autopilot. That looks cool. But, this is a bit more sophisticated. We use these in drones. We use these on surface vessels. And the technology to allow this to happen is you can go the open source route, and it's, very cheap. Or you can go, you spend lots and lots of dollars on that. And one of the ways that this can be done is by first perhaps a surface vessel mowing, I call it mowing the lawn, but you can see why. You're going in a very guided transect with the GPS position, and then over time, as you're going through that, you can clearly identify at certain depths, is this a good place to drop? Yes, no. It's too deep, I can't quite tell. Maybe then you employ a secondary opportunity. Maybe it's an AV, a diver, a mix of both, to sort of get a more detailed scan on that. The second element of that is to facilitate this with real-time substrate detection, which is a lot of an opportunity for computer vision and AI. So in this method, we'll be starting at the surface with surface-based cameras, such as the Reef Scan Transom, which was explained earlier as it's a high-resolution camera on a pole attached to a boat. However, there are challenges with this. It doesn't matter how good the camera is, turbidity always gets in the way. And the other one is sea state. So on some days it's clear, fantastic. On others, you can barely see the surface. So that changes one of the questions. One of the ways perhaps to mitigate this is by looking at sort of multispectral wavelengths to allow you to perhaps identify what are the better wavelengths that penetrate depth, and can you use that in addition to other models that you have to do sensor fusion to penetrate deeper for our substrate detection. So that sort of brings in the question of, could you use LiDAR? Or could you use a towed vehicle to go deeper, or again, AUVs as well. In addition to driving, going through the technological process, parallel to this, we're looking at doing capacity building exercises and workshops with different groups along the Great Barrier Reef in 3 regions, purely because, you really need to do this. Because if as I said before, the technology needs to work hand in hand with our engagement and our ability to do this consistently, and with that, technical knowledge. Finally, I'm gonna just do sort of a conceptual snapshot into what the deployment guidance system could look like in 2025. At the broadest stage, you've got reef site selection, which I touched on earlier. Then we're looking at the real-time detection for dispensing, the actual dispensing itself, and then finally monitoring. Real-time detection, by using a camera at the front of the vessel, you're able to sort of identify within a range where is good or bad substrate. In addition, where a lot of the work done at RRAP, some work that Juan presented on Tuesday, they've designed a heuristics spreadsheet and model that has different characteristics, abiotic and biotic elements to it, that allows you to pinpoint better and better places to deploy devices and different species, etc. And perhaps at the basic level, I've just put up a few on the screen as well. Now we get to dispensing. Dispensing, once the front camera comes, it falls into the water column and, guided by AI, a lot of the modeling that we've done, we can pinpoint accurately where it hits on the reef. And, this constant modeling and refinement of this process will allow us to improve in different sea states, in different areas, get more and more accurate as to where we put that. And while we dispense, we geotag. And why do we do that? So that we can have some compliance monitoring on the sense that, we can always come back to those spots and find where those devices are. Another element to that is through the aquaculture facility, if you're constantly marking, the life story of the coral recruits onto the devices into the water, and in time through that monitoring practice, you can begin to get a picture of the success rate of our pilot deployment program, both on a species level, but then also at scale as well. I drew this slide to sort of look at, perhaps one day, it'll be like we're having tractors on a boat, in a sense, where you have wider swath lengths to do the detection, and then you have more dispensing, like a boom arm at the back, or it could be the side. Just to look at, different optionality and ways that this can be done. Finally, I was sort of, we're doing some initial modeling at the moment around different technologies and when they're feasible in the field based on a cost per coral device. And, initially it'll be, crewed with some autopilot capabilities. Perhaps in the near future, we'll begin to use AUVs to do more specific site selection when required. But the big, two that are quite promising are also using UAVs and uncrewed surface vessels as well, as we scale up into the, larger hundreds of thousands and early millions of devices. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Great stuff. Do we have any questions for Ben?
Easy.
Hey, you were that thorough. Ben is... Oh, we do. We have a Slido question. Will robotics or AI also be able to detect unsuccessful devices for potential removal, or are there plans for unsuccessful devices aside from just abandon?
That's a really good question. Possibly. And that's something we'll take note and think about.
Any more questions for Ben? Well, thank you, Ben.
No worries.
A round of applause, please.